She slapped him in front of everyone, right there, in the aisle of a luxury jet soaring 30,000 feet above the Mediterranean. And she still didn't know. She thought he was just another black man trying to sneak into first class. But when the silence fell, and he looked up, her world began to unravel. It started hours earlier, on a breezy afternoon at the private terminal of Nice-Côte d'Azur Airport in France. The sky shimmered over the Riviera, casting long shadows on the tarmac as polished chauffeurs unloaded the luggage of billionaires, diplomats, and movie producers. Inside the lounge, it smelled faintly of citrus and old money. Leather seats, mahogany accents, soft piano music drifting through the air. The kind of place where everyone moved slowly because time had no value to them. They already owned too much of it. Marcus Ellison sat alone by the window, thumbing through a well-worn paperback. He wore a dark hoodie, perfectly clean but unbranded. His jeans were crisp, his shoes basic, his demeanor quiet. No bodyguards, no entourage, just a man and his book. To anyone else, he was invisible. Claire Duval, the lead flight attendant, noticed him the moment he stepped onto the tarmac. She always noticed. She'd been doing this job for 15 years and had learned to scan a person in seconds, watch their posture, clock their watch, judge their luggage, measure their worth. She believed her gut was always right, and her gut told her Marcus didn't belong. She greeted the high-profile guests as they boarded, famous faces, tech moguls, hedge fund heirs. Warm smiles for the platinum card elite, polite nods for the simply rich. But when Marcus reached the top of the stairs and entered the cabin, Claire didn't smile. She didn't even speak, just watched him. He gave her a nod. She didn't return it. Marcus took his seat in the first-class suite near the front of the cabin, seat 1A. He tucked his bag neatly under the seat, pulled out his book, and began to read. There was something calm about the way he did it. Not nervously, not trying to hide. Just settled. Like someone who had every right to be there. That's what unsettled Claire the most. She waited a moment. Then walked up the aisle, heels clicking sharply against the plush carpet. "I think you're in the wrong seat, sir," she said. Marcus looked up slowly. "This is seat 1A, isn't it?" "It is. But this section is for our first-class elite. Perhaps you're looking for the back cabin." He met her gaze, steady, not aggressive, but not submissive either. "You might want to double-check the manifest," he said. Claire's lips tightened. She didn't like being corrected, especially not by someone who didn't look like they had billions in the bank. And certainly not by someone who sat so calmly while surrounded by power, wealth, and skin far paler than his. "There's no mistake," she snapped. "If you don't move now, I'll be forced to call security once we land." Other passengers began to notice. A couple across the aisle leaned toward each other. A man 2 rows back raised an eyebrow. Whispered comments began to ripple. Marcus stayed still. "I'm not moving." Claire's jaw clenched. "You're causing a disturbance." "No," he said softly. "You are." She looked around, saw the eyes watching, felt the heat crawling up her neck. For a split second, she hesitated. Then, like a match snapping in the dark, she acted. Her hand lifted. It was quick, sharp, and reckless. And she slapped him. The sound cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. Gasps erupted. A wine glass somewhere tipped and shattered. Marcus didn't flinch. He slowly looked up at her, his voice a whisper. But it carried farther than any shout. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." No one spoke. Not yet. But in that stillness, thick with shame, disbelief, and something else creeping into Claire's spine, everyone in that cabin knew they'd just witnessed something that would not end quietly. Something had shifted, and Claire, who always believed she could tell who belonged, was about to learn just how wrong she'd been. The cabin was silent. Not the kind of silence born from peace, but the kind that follows a lightning strike. Tense, electric, waiting for something to break. Claire stood frozen. Her hand still tingled from the slap, but it was her mind that buzzed. She had felt in control moments ago, certain she was restoring order. But now the look in Marcus Ellison's eyes had taken that certainty from her. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't stood up, and yet somehow, she felt like she was the one shrinking. Marcus turned back to his book. That silence, his silence, was the first thing to shake her. Passengers whispered now, cautiously but louder than before. A middle-aged woman near the rear, elegantly dressed in a navy-wrap dress, leaned forward to the man next to her. "Did she really just slap him?" she asked, disbelief edging her voice. "God, I hope she didn't," the man replied. "But it sure sounded like it." A young couple across the aisle exchanged looks. The woman reached for her partner's hand, uneasy. Marcus flipped a page. Slowly. Deliberately. The gesture was quiet, but the message couldn't have been louder. He was not going anywhere. Claire turned sharply toward her junior, Jade, who stood rigid near the galley, eyes wide. "Escort him to the back," Claire hissed, low enough for only a few to hear, but laced with panic. Jade didn't move. Claire took a step closer. "Jade. Now." Still, the younger woman hesitated. She looked at Marcus, then at the other passengers, and then back at Claire. "He said it's his seat," Jade murmured, barely above a whisper. Claire's face hardened. "He's bluffing. Do you really think someone like him would be flying in this cabin without us knowing?" Jade said nothing, but the tremble in her fingers betrayed her. Claire huffed, turned to the passengers with a forced smile, the kind that masked unraveling control. "We apologize for the disturbance. Please enjoy your flight." But no one was enjoying anything. Marcus hadn't said another word. He didn't need to. He reached down, pulled out his phone, and typed something in silence. A single message, sent. Then he placed the phone face down on the armrest. That was the moment everything changed. The silence shifted. Again. This time, it wasn't just tension. It was anticipation. A knowing murmur moved like a quiet wave across the cabin. Something was coming. From the back, a man stood. Clean-cut, salt-and-pepper hair, wearing a military veteran's lapel pin. His voice was calm but firm. "Miss," he said to Claire. "With all due respect, I think it would be wise to verify his seat before this gets worse." Claire turned to him, her cheeks flushed. "Sir, this is none of your concern. It became my concern when you struck a man for sitting in a seat he paid for." Claire opened her mouth, but no words came. She looked at Jade again, now visibly shaking. A young boy in row 3 tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Why did she hit him?" he whispered. The mother closed her eyes. "Shh, baby, don't say anything." But it was too late. Everyone was saying something, and none of it favored Claire. Jade, finally summoning courage, began quietly walking toward the front of the cabin, toward the manifest list clipped beside the cockpit door. Her steps were small but determined. Claire saw her and snapped louder this time. "Jade, I told you, stand down!" But Jade kept walking. Marcus still hadn't moved, still hadn't spoken. He didn't need to. The silence that surrounded him had become its own force, steady, unsettling, powerful. And it was working. A few rows back, a man in his 40s, well-dressed in a business-class blazer, leaned across the aisle toward Marcus. "Sir," he asked gently, "do you need anything?" Marcus turned to him. His expression softened, just slightly. "No, thank you." The man nodded, offered a respectful smile, and leaned back. Claire spun toward him, her voice rising. "Please don't encourage the disruption." The man's face fell. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you're the one making a scene." That statement stuck in the air like smoke. Claire's confidence, already fraying, began to crumble. She took a step back, looked around. Faces were no longer neutral. They were questioning. Some were angry. She turned to Marcus one last time, her voice taut. "You've caused enough trouble for one flight. Either move, or I'll have you removed." Marcus looked up from his book. His eyes didn't blink. His voice didn't shake. "You can try." That was the line. The final one. Claire felt it, like a tightrope snapping beneath her. She stepped back, unsteady. Jade reached the manifest. She unhooked the clipboard, scanned the names. Her lips parted, her brow furrowed. And in that moment, even before she said a word, Claire knew. She'd made a terrible mistake. But the consequences hadn't even started yet. Jade's fingers trembled slightly as she ran down the manifest. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat growing louder as her eyes landed on a name near the top. And when she saw it, Marcus Ellison, owner. The air seemed to thicken around her. She turned slowly, her gaze shifting from the list to the man who had sat so still, so composed, while chaos tried to strip away his dignity. Claire, still stationed mid-aisle, like a soldier guarding imagined borders, locked eyes with her. "What is it?" Claire snapped, her voice more brittle than commanding now. Jade swallowed hard, her throat dry. "He's not a passenger," she said quietly. "He's the owner." Claire didn't react at first, like her brain refused to translate the words. What did you say?" Jade held the clipboard tighter. "Marcus Ellison. He's not just cleared to be here. He owns this plane." It hit like a sudden drop in altitude. From the front of the cabin, the cockpit door opened. Captain Harrison emerged, his usually stoic face marked with tension. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, fueled by Jade's revelation, but when the captain stepped fully into view, a hush fell again. He looked directly at Claire. "We just received a call from Ellison Aviation, confirming that the owner is on board." Claire opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she looked truly unsure. Vulnerable, even. Captain Harrison shifted his eyes to Marcus. "Mr. Ellison? I apologize for the delay and the misunderstanding. We've taken steps to correct it." Marcus didn't speak. He simply nodded once. Calm, poised, unshaken. Behind the captain, two figures stepped onto the aircraft. A man and a woman, both dressed in sleek gray suits with discreet Ellison Aviation lapel pins. They walked with purpose, not a hint of showiness. Their very presence shifted the energy of the cabin again. "Mr. Ellison," the man said respectfully, "we're here at your request." Claire's lips parted. "You," she stammered. "You called them?" Marcus turned to her now, slowly, and looked her straight in the eye. "No," he said. "I sent one message. It was enough." Claire's breath caught. Around her, passengers watched silently, most in awe, some in growing discomfort. They had all seen what she had done. They had heard her words, witnessed the slap, the threats, the arrogance. And now, reality turned on its axis. Claire tried to rally. "Mr. Ellison, I didn't know who you were. If I had known—" He cut her off with the quiet force of a man who no longer had anything to prove. "That's exactly the point." She blinked. I didn't mean—" "But you did," he said. "You meant every assumption, every command, every ounce of disrespect. The mistake wasn't that you didn't know who I was. It's that you didn't think I could be." The words weren't angry. They weren't loud, but they hit with precision. Not just at Claire, but at everyone who had ever let silence stand in for justice. Claire's posture sagged. She glanced toward the captain, searching for some kind of lifeline. But his eyes had shifted to Marcus now, deference etched into every line of his face. The male assistant stepped forward. "Mr. Ellison, we've already issued the order. Ms. Duval's employment is being terminated effective immediately." Claire's eyes widened. "Wait, please. This is my career." Marcus studied her. "You had a career when you struck me. You had authority when you threatened to humiliate me in front of a plane full of strangers. What you didn't have," he said, his voice low, "was judgment." He didn't need to say more. Claire was escorted toward the front exit. No applause, no drama. Just the quiet sound of her footsteps receding down the aisle, each step a reminder of what prejudice could cost. When she was gone, Captain Harrison looked to Marcus again. "Sir, how would you like to proceed?" Marcus glanced around the cabin. "We continue the flight." But before he sat, he turned to Jade. "Thank you," he said softly. Jade looked stunned. I didn't do much." "You did enough," Marcus replied. You listen to your conscience. As he returned to his seat, passengers slowly began to process what they had witnessed. A man who had been judged for his skin, silenced by assumption, and struck in public had just reclaimed not only his dignity, but the very space meant to strip it away. And he had done it without ever raising his voice. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a soft and steady rhythm against the storm that had just passed. The tension had shifted, not disappeared, but evolved, replaced now by something heavier. Reflection. Even the air felt different. Passengers were no longer whispering. Some stared out the windows, others sat with folded arms and furrowed brows. Silence, once weaponized, now served as a witness. Marcus Ellison sat back in his seat, his hands resting gently on his lap, the book untouched beside him. He wasn't reading anymore. He was remembering. Across the aisle, Jade remained by the galley. Her posture was more relaxed, but her mind hadn't stopped racing. She had seen something today that shook her, something that went beyond airline policy or job protocol. It was something personal, something human. She hesitated a moment, then stepped across the aisle and leaned toward Marcus, speaking softly. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus looked up. His eyes were kind but distant, as if they were still sorting through memories. "Of course," he replied. How did you stay that calm?" she asked. "I mean, after everything that happened, I don't think I could have." He offered her a faint smile, the kind that came from places much older than words. "Because this wasn't new to me," he said. He turned toward the window, watching clouds drift past like ghosts. "When I was 10, Marcus began, my father took me on a commercial flight. It was the first one I ever remembered. We were heading to D.C. for a veterans event. He served in Vietnam. Bronze Star. Quiet man. Disciplined. He wore his best suit that day. I wore a clip-on tie." He paused, then continued. "We had our tickets. We boarded early. But before we could take our seats, a flight attendant approached us. She looked confused, then suspicious. Said we must have been given the wrong boarding group. She didn't even look at the ticket. Just saw him. Saw me. And made a decision." Jade listened, hands clasped in front of her, expression softening. "They pulled us aside," Marcus continued. "Told us to wait until the last passengers boarded. Then told us there was a mistake. They'd overbooked. My father didn't say a word. He just nodded, took my hand, and we walked back off the plane. I was crying. He wasn't. He looked at Jade, eyes steady. You know what he said to me when I asked him why he didn't argue?" She shook her head. "He said, 'Because our silence today plants something bigger than our anger ever could. One day, when you're in the sky, remember this moment, and what to do with it.'" Jade blinked back tears. "I've carried that moment ever since," Marcus said. "And 1,000 more like it. Meetings where I was assumed to be the assistant. Fundraisers where I was asked if I knew the valet. Investors who looked through me before realizing they were looking at the one holding the equity." He leaned back again, his voice quiet, almost to himself. "I've spent my entire life being underestimated, and I've spent my entire life making that their problem. Not mine." Jade was silent for a moment. "You turned it into power," she whispered. "No," he said gently. "I turned it into purpose." They sat there for a while, the stillness between them speaking volumes. Eventually, Jade stood and returned to her post, but she walked differently now, head higher, steps firmer. She had seen what leadership looked like. Not the kind built on titles or uniforms, but the kind that grows from pain and patience. From stillness, not shouting. Marcus reached for his tablet and opened a draft. It was a letter addressed to his entire staff. Pilots, crew, maintenance, operations, corporate, every department under the Ellison aviation name. He didn't write about what had happened on the flight, not directly. He didn't name names. Instead, he wrote about respect, about the weight of assumptions, about how companies don't fail because of market trends. They fail because they forget who they serve and why. He wrote about his father, about the first flight, about Jade, who had spoken up when it counted. And then, near the end, he wrote a single line that would stay with everyone who read it. We don't fly above bias, we fly through it. What matters is who's holding the yoke when the storm hits. He saved the draft, closed the tablet, and finally picked up his book again. But this time, he wasn't reading it for escape. He was reading it as a man who knew exactly where he was going, and exactly how to take everyone else there with him. 3 months had passed since the flight. The story had traveled faster than any aircraft in Marcus Ellison's fleet. Not because he sought attention. He hadn't. He had never once addressed the media directly. But the passengers had spoken. Some posted videos. Others wrote open letters. And before long, headlines appeared on news tickers, on think pieces, on primetime interviews. The man in seat 1A. The owner who said nothing. Billionaire slapped, responds with dignity. But Marcus didn't chase virality. He chased vision. And that vision began unfolding at the headquarters of Ellison Aviation. The campaign launched with little fanfare, but its message was unmistakable. On every aircraft, every training document, and every wall of every terminal under his name, 3 words now stood in bold, understated font. Respect comes first. It wasn't just a branding initiative. It was structural, deep, transformational. Marcus hired a team of diversity and human dignity consultants, real people, not corporate placeholders. He met with them personally, not once, but weekly. Pilots were retrained, cabin crews recertified. Hiring protocols were revised to ensure cultural humility, not just customer service. Promotions were paused and restructured based on how team members treated those they believed had nothing to offer them. And it didn't stop there. He introduced anonymous reporting systems that protected whistleblowers, created scholarships for underrepresented youth pursuing aviation and aeronautical engineering, partnered with community colleges and inner-city programs. When someone asked why he was investing so much into the foundation of an already successful empire, Marcus only said, "Because altitude means nothing if the runway is cracked." His voice, once reserved, now carried weight not just in boardrooms, but in communities that had never even stepped on a plane. And it resonated because it was never about his wealth. It was about his witness. One of the first recipients of his new scholarship program was a 12-year-old boy from Atlanta named Noah Parker. Noah had written Marcus a letter, carefully handwritten in blue ink. "Dear Mr. Ellison, they say kids like me don't grow up to fly planes. But after I heard your story, I know that's not true. One day, I want to sit where you sat, and when they ask why, I'll say, because the sky belongs to all of us." Marcus kept that letter on his desk, framed, not as a trophy, but as a compass. One afternoon, as he prepared for a keynote at an aviation conference, an aide reminded him of the time slot. He was scheduled to speak about innovation and global sustainability in the private airline industry. But as he stood behind the curtain, notes in hand, he folded the pages and placed them in his jacket pocket. He walked on stage to a silent room and looked at the crowd. Not just investors and engineers, but students, journalists, airport workers, regulators. He began simply. "We spend billions designing cabins that are quieter, engines that are lighter, seats that recline a little farther. But none of that matters if the people inside those cabins feel small." There was a pause. Not the awkward kind, but the reflective one. The kind that settles into a room like fog. "We built the sky to be exclusive," he continued. "We fenced off the clouds and made entry a privilege. But I believe something different. I believe the sky should feel like possibility, not proof of status. I believe flight should be a metaphor for freedom, not a mirror of the prejudice we thought we left on the ground." The room was still. And then, applause. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady, honest, from people who knew they had just heard something that would outlive the moment. Back at Ellison Aviation, the culture began to change, not overnight, but day by day. Small things, crew members greeting passengers by name, including the quiet ones in row 5. Gate agents taking a second look at their assumptions. Hiring managers reconsidering what professionalism looks like. Jade, the junior flight attendant who had stood silently for too long, was now a team leader in the company's leadership development program. Marcus had met with her again, months after the flight, to thank her once more. Not for what she had done, but for what she chose not to ignore. "You listened," he said. "And that's how movements begin." On a clear spring morning, Marcus took to the skies himself. It had been years since he sat in the pilot's seat. Years of delegation, expansion, schedules packed to the brim. But this day, he needed to remember what it felt like. The Ellison 7, a jet he had personally overseen from blueprint to runway, stood gleaming on the tarmac. The door closed. The cockpit light. He took the controls. As the jet ascended, the sun broke through the clouds in a burst of gold and white. Below him, the earth blurred into a soft watercolor of terrain and memory. Above him, the sky opened wide, endless, unmarked, free. He exhaled. This was why he had waited. Why he had stayed quiet that day. Why he hadn't demanded recognition. Because now, flying at 40,000 feet, not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, not as a headline, but as a man reclaiming something stolen from him long ago, he knew the truth his father had whispered so many years ago. Silence, when rooted in dignity, grows louder than any noise. And it echoes long after the turbulence ends. Marcus Ellison's story began in silence, and it ended with transformation. What looked like a moment of humiliation, being slapped and publicly shamed on his own plane, became a masterclass in grace under fire, and a powerful reminder that dignity doesn't require volume. In a world that often expects loudness to prove worth, Marcus chose stillness. He didn't fight with fists or shout for validation. He waited, and when the moment was right, truth revealed itself. The passengers on that flight witnessed something rare. Not just the downfall of someone who acted from prejudice, but the rise of someone who stood in quiet strength. Marcus didn't just win that day. He inspired a ripple effect that redefined how an entire industry sees people, beyond their clothes, their skin, or their seat assignment. His calm dismantled assumption. His leadership corrected injustice. And his silence spoke louder than 1,000 angry voices ever could. He reminded us that success doesn't always look the way people expect. That power doesn't have to roar to be real. That wealth, at its best, is not what you accumulate, but what you choose to change. And when the storm hit, he didn't reach for ego. He reached for purpose. In the weeks that followed, he didn't post on social media or go on talk shows for applause. He created scholarships, he changed policy, he lifted others. He turned a moment of personal disrespect into a movement for collective dignity. And in doing so, Marcus became more than a business leader. He became a symbol of what happens when you lead from your values, not your pride. So what's the lesson for us? It's this. You don't have to be a billionaire to walk with self-worth. You don't need a title to demand respect. Whether you're a teacher in a forgotten town, a mechanic holding your family together, or someone simply trying to be seen, you matter. And when the world underestimates you, remember Marcus. Don't rush to prove them wrong. Stand firm, breathe, let the truth rise in its own time. Because when you know who you are, no one else gets to define you. And if you ever find yourself sitting in a room, or a plane, where someone looks at you and assumes you don't belong, don't argue. Just smile. Because maybe, just maybe, they're sitting next to someone far more powerful than they'll ever realize. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own quiet strength or opened your eyes to how bias still hides in plain sight, then help us keep these stories alive. Subscribe to the channel. Support the message. Share it with someone who needs to believe in something bigger than injustice. Because we're just getting started, and your support gives us the power to keep telling the stories that need to be told. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.